Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her black Mercedes in the parking lot behind the downtown courthouse. The morning sun caught the shine of her expensive watch as she checked the time. 9:15 in the morning. She was running exactly on schedule, just like every other day of her successful career. Sarah was 35 years old and had spent the last 10 years building her reputation as one of the toughest lawyers in the city. She worked for Mitchell and Associates, a law firm that handled big corporate cases. Her office was on the 20th floor of a glass building downtown. The walls were covered with awards and certificates that showed how many cases she had won. Today, she wore a sharp black business suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Her hair was pulled back in a perfect bun without a single strand out of place. Everything about Sarah screamed success and power. She carried herself like someone who had never lost a case and never planned to start. Walking toward the courthouse entrance, Sarah pulled out her phone to check her messages. 3 new clients wanted to hire her firm. 2 judges had complimented her work on recent cases. Her assistant had confirmed lunch with the mayor next week. Life was good when you were at the top of your game. Sarah had grown up in a wealthy family where winning was everything. Her father was a successful businessman who taught her that being tough was the only way to survive in the legal world. Her mother was a socialite who showed her how to dress for success and command respect in any room. Both parents had drilled into her head that showing weakness was the same as losing. The courthouse security guard recognized Sarah immediately. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," he said with a respectful nod. She barely acknowledged him as she walked through the metal detector. Small talk with working-class people was not something Sarah bothered with. She had more important things on her mind. Taking the elevator to the 3rd floor, Sarah reviewed the case in her mind. It was a simple eviction case. Her client was Peterson Real Estate, a big company that owned apartment buildings all over the city. They wanted to evict a tenant who they claimed had violated the lease agreement. The tenant supposedly had too many people living in the apartment and had damaged the property. Sarah had handled hundreds of these cases before. They usually took less than an hour. Most tenants could not afford good lawyers, so they either showed up alone or with some inexperienced public defender. Either way, Sarah always won. The judges knew her reputation and trusted her legal arguments. She stepped off the elevator and walked down the long hallway toward courtroom 3B. Her heels clicked loudly on the polished floor. Other lawyers and court staff moved out of her way without her having to ask. Everyone knew Sarah Mitchell, and everyone knew not to waste her time. Opening her briefcase, Sarah pulled out a thin folder with the case documents. She had barely spent 20 minutes preparing for this hearing. Why should she waste more time on something so simple? The tenant had broken the lease rules. Peterson Real Estate wanted them out. Case closed. Sarah believed that poor people who could not pay their rent on time deserved whatever happened to them. She had worked hard to get where she was, and she expected everyone else to do the same. People who made excuses about money problems or family issues were just weak in her opinion. As she approached the courtroom door, Sarah felt the familiar rush of confidence that came before every legal battle. She had never lost an eviction case, and today would be no different. Some inexperienced lawyer, or maybe even a tenant representing themselves, would try to argue with her. She would destroy their arguments in minutes and be back in her office before noon. Sarah pushed open the heavy wooden door to courtroom 3B, ready to add another easy victory to her perfect record. She had no idea that this case would be completely different from every other case she had ever handled. She had no idea that her whole world was about to change in ways she could never imagine. Sarah entered courtroom 3B and immediately felt at home. The familiar smell of old wood and leather books filled her nose. She had won so many cases in this exact room that it felt like her second office. The judge's bench stood empty and imposing at the front. Rows of wooden benches filled the space where people could sit and watch the proceedings. She walked confidently toward the plaintiff's table on the left side of the room. This was where she always sat when representing the person or company filing the lawsuit. Her expensive briefcase made a soft thud as she set it down on the polished wooden surface. Sarah began arranging her papers in neat piles, each document exactly where she wanted it. As she organized her materials, Sarah's eyes wandered around the courtroom to see who else had arrived. The defendant's table on the right side of the room caught her attention. Someone was already sitting there, quietly working on something. Sarah looked more closely and saw a young black man who appeared to be in his early 20s. The young man wore a simple light blue button-down shirt that looked clean but not expensive. His khaki pants were pressed but showed signs of being worn many times. Sarah noticed that his clothes fit him well even though they were clearly not designer brands like her own outfit. Everything about his appearance suggested he did not have much money. What surprised Sarah most was how calm and focused the young man seemed. He had a worn brown leather briefcase sitting on the table next to him. The briefcase looked like it had seen many years of use, but was well taken care of. He was writing something in a yellow legal pad with a regular blue pen, his handwriting neat and careful. Sarah assumed he must be the tenant who was being evicted. Maybe he was the son or nephew of the actual tenant, she thought to herself. Poor families often sent their younger relatives to court because they thought it might get them more sympathy from the judge. Sarah had seen this strategy many times before, and it never worked. She watched as the young man continued writing his notes. He would occasionally pause, think for a moment, then continue writing. Sometimes he would flip through some papers in a manila folder, read something carefully, then go back to his writing. Sarah found it amusing that he was working so hard on what was obviously a hopeless case. The young man seemed completely comfortable in the formal courtroom setting. He did not look around nervously like most people did when they came to court for the first time. He did not fidget in his chair or check his phone every few minutes. Instead, he appeared focused and prepared, as if he had been in courtrooms many times before. Sarah turned to her assistant Jennifer, who had just arrived with coffee for both of them. She nodded toward the defendant's table and whispered quietly so only Jennifer could hear. "Look at that kid over there. He probably thinks he can represent himself and win against us. This case will be over before lunchtime." Jennifer glanced over at the young man and smiled. She had worked with Sarah for 3 years and had seen many people try to fight eviction cases without proper legal help. Most of them had good intentions but no real understanding of how the law worked. The legal system was complicated and required years of training to navigate successfully. Sarah sipped her coffee and continued watching the young man work. She noticed that he had several books stacked beside his briefcase. They looked like law books based on their size and thickness. She wondered where he had gotten them. Maybe from the public library, she thought. Some people checked out legal books thinking they could learn enough to represent themselves in court. The courtroom was starting to fill up with other people. Court clerks were preparing their paperwork for the day. A few other lawyers had arrived for different cases scheduled later in the morning. The bailiff was checking that all the security equipment was working properly. Sarah felt completely confident about how this case would go. She had her legal arguments prepared. She had all the evidence she needed to prove the tenant had violated the lease agreement. Most importantly, she had 10 years of experience winning cases exactly like this one. The young man at the defendant's table continued his quiet preparation, completely unaware that Sarah was watching him and already planning her victory. At exactly 10 o'clock, Judge Henderson entered the courtroom through the door behind his bench. Everyone in the room stood up immediately as the bailiff announced his arrival. Judge Henderson was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and kind but serious eyes. He had been hearing cases in this courthouse for over 20 years and had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense. Sarah stood at her table with perfect posture, her hands clasped professionally in front of her. She had appeared before Judge Henderson many times and knew he respected lawyers who were prepared and direct. The judge took his seat and gestured for everyone else to sit down as well. "Good morning, everyone," Judge Henderson said as he opened the case file on his desk. "We are here today for the case of Peterson Real Estate versus Johnson. This is an eviction proceeding." He looked up from his papers and scanned the courtroom to see who was present. Sarah stood up smoothly and spoke in her most professional voice. "Good morning, Your Honor. Sarah Mitchell from Mitchell & Associates representing the plaintiff Peterson Real Estate." She remained standing and waited for the defendant to introduce themselves, expecting to hear from someone with little legal experience. What happened next shocked Sarah completely. The young man at the defendant's table stood up calmly and spoke with clear confidence. "Good morning, Your Honor." Marcus Johnson representing the defendant. His voice was strong and professional, with the kind of tone that suggested he was comfortable speaking in courtrooms. Sarah felt her eyebrows raise slightly in surprise. She had assumed the young man was the tenant being evicted, not a lawyer representing the tenant. But even so, she figured he must be some kind of legal aid attorney, or maybe a law student getting practice experience. There was no way someone so young could have much real legal experience. Judge Henderson looked between the two attorneys and nodded. "Very well. Before we begin the hearing, I want to make sure both sides are ready to proceed. Miss Mitchell, are you prepared to present your case?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied confidently. She had been preparing for cases like this one for years and could probably argue an eviction case in her sleep. The judge turned to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, are you ready to defend your client?" Sarah noticed that Judge Henderson seemed to know Marcus was a lawyer without asking for clarification. This surprised her because she had assumed the judge would need to verify that Marcus was qualified to represent someone in court. "Yes, Your Honor, I am fully prepared," Marcus answered. His response was calm and confident, without any of the nervousness Sarah expected from someone who was probably appearing in court for the first time. During the brief conference before the hearing officially began, Sarah could not resist making some comments to Marcus. She walked over to the defendant's table and spoke in a voice that was supposed to sound helpful but came across as condescending. "You know, eviction cases can be very complicated," Sarah said to Marcus. "The law has a lot of technical requirements that can be confusing for people who are not familiar with housing court procedures. Maybe you should consider advising your client to settle this matter quickly to avoid any embarrassment." Marcus looked up from his notes and met Sarah's eyes directly. His expression remained polite, but showed no signs of intimidation. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Mitchell, but I am confident in my preparation and my client's position. We are ready to proceed with the hearing." Sarah felt slightly annoyed by Marcus's calm response. She had expected him to seem worried or at least ask her some questions about how these cases usually went. Instead, he acted like he knew exactly what he was doing. She decided to push a little harder. "I just want to make sure you have proper authorization to represent the defendant in this matter," Sarah continued. "Sometimes people try to help family members or friends in court without understanding that there are rules about who can provide legal representation." Marcus remained completely calm as he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. He handed it to Sarah without saying a word. She looked at it and saw that it was a properly signed attorney-client agreement along with a court filing that showed Marcus was the official lawyer of record for the defendant. Judge Henderson watched this exchange with interest. He had seen many lawyers try to intimidate their opponents before hearings began, but something about this situation seemed different. The young lawyer at the defendant's table showed no signs of being rattled by the experienced corporate attorney's attempts to unnerve him. Sarah returned the document to Marcus and walked back to her table, feeling frustrated that her psychological tactics had not worked. She was used to opponents who seemed nervous or unsure of themselves. Marcus appeared to be neither of those things. The judge called both attorneys back to their tables and prepared to begin the hearing. Sarah arranged her papers one more time and got ready to present what she assumed would be an easy case. She had no idea that the next hour would change everything she thought she knew about winning in court. Judge Henderson struck his gavel once to officially begin the hearing. The sound echoed through the quiet courtroom. Sarah felt the familiar rush of excitement that came at the start of every legal battle. This was what she lived for, the chance to prove she was the smartest person in the room. "Miss Mitchell, please present your case for the plaintiff," the judge said as he leaned back in his chair. Sarah stood up and walked to the podium in the center of the courtroom. She carried her notes with her, but barely needed to look at them. She had given this same type of presentation hundreds of times before. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of lease violation and the need for immediate eviction," Sarah began in her most authoritative voice. The defendant has clearly violated multiple terms of the rental agreement with Peterson Real Estate. She opened her folder and pulled out several photographs. The evidence shows that the defendant has allowed more people to live in the apartment than permitted under the lease terms, Sarah continued. Our property manager counted at least 6 people living in a unit that was rented to only 2 adults. She held up photos that showed extra mattresses and personal belongings scattered around a small apartment. Sarah felt completely in control as she presented each piece of evidence. She explained how the tenant had damaged the kitchen by leaving grease stains on the walls. She showed pictures of scratches on the hardwood floors that she claimed were caused by moving furniture without proper protection. She pointed out that the tenant was 3 days late with rent payment twice in the past 6 months. Furthermore, Your Honor, the defendant has shown a pattern of disrespecting the property and ignoring the rules that all tenants must follow, Sarah said as she walked back and forth in front of the judge's bench. Peterson Real Estate has been more than patient with this tenant, giving multiple warnings and opportunities to correct these violations. Sarah presented copies of warning letters that had been sent to the tenant. She showed the lease agreement with the violated sections highlighted in yellow. She explained how Peterson Real Estate had tried to work with the tenant to resolve these issues without going to court. Everything seemed to be going exactly as Sarah had planned. The law is very clear in cases like this, Sarah concluded confidently. When a tenant repeatedly violates lease terms despite warnings, the landlord has the right to terminate the rental agreement and evict the tenant. We ask the court to grant immediate eviction and award damages for the repairs needed to restore the apartment to rentable condition. Sarah walked back to her table feeling completely satisfied with her presentation. She had covered all the important points and presented strong evidence to support her client's position. Judge Henderson was taking notes as she spoke, which was always a good sign. She sat down and looked over at Marcus, expecting to see worry or confusion on his face. Instead, Marcus was writing steadily in his legal pad, occasionally referring to documents in his manila folder. He did not look nervous or overwhelmed by Sarah's presentation. If anything, he seemed to be checking items off some kind of list as she had made each point. Sarah found his calm reaction strange and slightly annoying. Mr. Johnson, please present your defense, Judge Henderson said as he looked toward the defendant's table. Sarah settled back in her chair, prepared to listen to what she assumed would be a weak and disorganized response from an inexperienced attorney. Marcus stood up and walked to the podium with his notes and several documents. He adjusted the microphone slightly and looked directly at Judge Henderson. When he began to speak, his voice was clear and confident in a way that immediately got everyone's attention. Your Honor, the plaintiff's case is built on false assumptions, incomplete evidence, and a fundamental misunderstanding of tenant rights under both state and federal law, Marcus said calmly. Every single claim made by Miss Mitchell can be easily disproven with proper documentation and legal precedent. Sarah felt her confident smile begin to fade. This was not how defendants usually started their arguments in eviction cases. Most of them made emotional appeals about needing more time or having financial difficulties. Marcus sounded like he was about to present a serious legal challenge to her case. The plaintiff claims my client violated occupancy limits, but they have failed to prove that any additional residents are permanent occupants rather than temporary guests, Marcus continued. Under housing law, tenants have the right to have visitors and family members stay for reasonable periods without violating lease terms. Marcus pulled out a thick folder and opened it on the podium. Sarah could see that it contained many official-looking documents with legal seals and court stamps. Where had a young attorney gotten access to so much legal research material? The plaintiff's photographs were taken without proper notice and may constitute illegal entry under state housing codes, Marcus said as he held up copies of the same photos Sarah had presented. My client was never informed that property managers would be entering the apartment to take pictures, which violates the 24-hour notice requirement in the lease agreement itself. Judge Henderson leaned forward with obvious interest. Sarah felt a small knot forming in her stomach as she realized that Marcus was raising legal issues she had never considered. She had always assumed that landlords could document lease violations however they wanted. The idea that there might be rules about how evidence could be collected had never occurred to her. Marcus continued his methodical destruction of Sarah's case, addressing each point she had made with specific legal citations and alternative explanations. Sarah watched in growing disbelief as this young man she had dismissed demonstrated knowledge of housing law that seemed to exceed her own. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official documents. Sarah watched with growing concern as he arranged them carefully on the podium. These were not photocopies from library books or printouts from the internet. These looked like original legal filings, court orders, and government reports. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Peterson Real Estate has engaged in a systematic pattern of harassment and illegal practices designed to force long-term tenants out of their homes, Marcus said as he held up the first document. This is not an isolated eviction case, but part of a larger scheme to displace low-income residents. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. Marcus was not just defending against the eviction charges. He was accusing her client of illegal behavior. She had never encountered a defense strategy like this in a simple housing case. Most tenants just asked for more time to pay rent or fix lease violations. This document is a complaint filed with the City Housing Authority, showing that Peterson Real Estate has failed to make required safety repairs in the building where my client lives. Marcus continued. The landlord has known about broken locks, faulty electrical wiring, and plumbing problems for over 8 months, but has refused to address these issues. Marcus showed the judge photographs that looked completely different from the ones Sarah had presented. These pictures showed water damage, exposed electrical wires, and holes in walls that had been covered with cardboard. Sarah had never seen these photos before and had no idea they existed. The plaintiff claims my client damaged the kitchen, but these pictures show that the grease stains and wall damage existed before my client moved into the apartment, Marcus explained calmly. The property management company failed to clean or repair the unit between tenants, then tried to blame the new renter for pre-existing problems. Judge Henderson examined the photographs carefully and made notes in the case file. Sarah could see that he was taking Marcus's evidence seriously. She began to feel panic rising in her chest as she realized her case was falling apart before her eyes. Marcus pulled out another set of documents and continued his presentation. These are records from the city building inspector showing that Peterson Real Estate has received dozens of violation notices for this property alone. The landlord has been fined multiple times for failing to maintain safe and habitable conditions for tenants. Sarah had never heard about building violations or inspector reports. Her client had told her this was a simple case of a problem tenant who needed to be removed. No one had mentioned anything about safety issues or government fines. She began to wonder what other information Peterson Real Estate had not shared with her. Furthermore, Your Honor, the late rent payments that the plaintiff mentioned were caused by the landlord's own actions, Marcus said as he held up more paperwork. My client was forced to pay for emergency repairs that were the landlord's responsibility when Peterson Real Estate refused to fix a broken heating system during winter months. Marcus showed receipts for furnace repairs, plumbing work, and electrical fixes that the tenant had paid for out of her own pocket. Under housing law, tenants have the right to deduct necessary repair costs from their rent when landlords fail to maintain the property, he explained. My client followed all proper procedures for documenting these expenses. Sarah watched in amazement as Marcus cited specific sections of the state housing code from memory. He referenced court cases from other states that had established important precedents for tenant rights. He quoted federal fair housing laws that protected renters from discrimination and retaliation. This young man knew more about housing law than many attorneys who specialized in real estate. The most serious issue in this case, Your Honor, is that Peterson Real Estate began eviction proceedings immediately after my client filed complaints with the Housing Authority. Marcus continued. This timeline suggests that the eviction is retaliatory rather than based on legitimate lease violations, which is illegal under both state and federal law. Marcus presented a timeline that showed the tenant had filed official complaints about unsafe conditions on a Monday. Peterson Real Estate had issued an eviction notice the following Friday. The connection between these two events was clear and damaging to Sarah's case. "My client is not just an innocent victim, Your Honor," Marcus said as his voice grew stronger with conviction. "She is an elderly woman who has lived in the same apartment for 15 years, paying her rent on time and maintaining the property better than the landlord has. She deserves protection under the law, not harassment and illegal eviction." Judge Henderson looked at all the evidence Marcus had presented and then turned to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, did you know about these housing violations and inspection reports when you filed this eviction case?" he asked in a serious tone. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment. She had to admit that Peterson Real Estate had not told her about any problems with the property or complaints from government agencies. She had assumed her client was telling her the complete truth about the situation. Marcus was not finished with his presentation. He pulled out one final document that made Sarah's heart sink completely. "This is a federal lawsuit that my client filed yesterday in district court, alleging housing discrimination and civil rights violations by Peterson Real Estate," he announced. "The eviction case we are hearing today is just one part of a much larger legal battle." Sarah tried to compose herself as Judge Henderson gave her the opportunity to respond to Marcus's devastating presentation. She stood up on shaky legs and walked back to the podium, her mind racing to find some way to salvage her case. For the first time in her career, she felt completely unprepared and outmatched. "Your Honor," Sarah began with much less confidence than before, "the plaintiff was not aware of these alleged housing violations when we filed this eviction case. We relied on information provided by the property management company and acted in good faith based on documented lease violations." Even as she spoke, Sarah knew her response sounded weak and unconvincing. Marcus had presented overwhelming evidence that her client had been dishonest about the true situation. She felt exposed and foolish for not doing more thorough research before coming to court. Marcus stood up smoothly to object. "Your Honor, ignorance of housing law violations is not a valid defense for landlords or their attorneys. Both have a legal obligation to ensure that eviction proceedings are based on legitimate grounds rather than retaliation or discrimination." Judge Henderson nodded in agreement. "Mr. Johnson is correct, Miss Mitchell. The law requires landlords to act in good faith and follow proper procedures regardless of what information they provide to their legal counsel. It is also the responsibility of attorneys to verify the facts of any case they present to the court." Sarah felt her professional reputation crumbling before her eyes. She had built her career on being thorough and prepared, but Marcus had exposed serious gaps in her research and preparation. She tried to focus on the original lease violations, but Marcus was ready for every argument she attempted to make. "The photographs of additional occupants do not prove permanent residency, Your Honor," Marcus said calmly as Sarah tried to present her evidence again. "Temporary guests and family visitors are permitted under tenant rights laws, and my client has documentation showing that the additional people were helping her recover from surgery and caring for her during a medical emergency." Marcus pulled out medical records and doctor's notes that explained why the elderly tenant had needed extra help at home. He showed a hospital discharge summary that recommended having family members assist with daily activities during recovery. Sarah had never seen any of this medical information and realized her client had painted a completely false picture of the situation. The late rent payments were directly caused by the landlord's failure to provide basic services like heat and hot water, Marcus continued as he addressed each of Sarah's original arguments. "My client was forced to stay in a hotel during the coldest week of winter when the heating system broke down completely. She used her rent money to pay for emergency housing, while the landlord ignored her requests for repairs." Marcus showed hotel receipts and documented phone calls to Peterson Real Estate requesting emergency repairs. The paper trail clearly showed that the tenant had tried repeatedly to get the landlord to fix dangerous problems before paying for solutions herself. Sarah's argument about late payments looked petty and unreasonable in comparison. Judge Henderson asked Sarah several pointed questions about her client's maintenance responsibilities and whether Peterson Real Estate had properly investigated the tenant's complaints before filing for eviction. Sarah had to admit that she did not know the answers to most of his questions because her client had not provided complete information. Miss Mitchell, it appears that your client may have violated several tenant protection laws, the judge said sternly. The evidence presented by Mr. Johnson raises serious questions about whether this eviction case was filed in good faith or as retaliation against a tenant who reported legitimate safety concerns. Sarah felt sweat forming on her forehead as she realized the judge was considering sanctions against her client. She had never been in a situation where a simple eviction case had turned into potential criminal charges for housing code violations and tenant harassment. Marcus presented his closing arguments with the skill and precision of a master craftsman. He wove together all the evidence into a compelling narrative that painted Peterson Real Estate as a predatory landlord that targeted vulnerable tenants with illegal tactics. His presentation was so thorough and convincing that Sarah could see the judge becoming more angry with each new piece of evidence. Your Honor, this case represents everything that is wrong with how some landlords treat low-income tenants, Marcus said with quiet passion. They assume that poor people cannot afford good legal representation and will not fight back against illegal eviction attempts. They count on tenants being too scared or uninformed to know their rights under the. Sarah watched helplessly as Marcus requested not only that the eviction be denied, but that Peterson Real Estate be ordered to pay substantial damages to the tenant for illegal harassment and housing code violations. He asked the judge to refer the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution of the landlord's illegal business practices. The transformation in the courtroom atmosphere was complete. What had started as a routine eviction hearing had become a major legal victory for tenant rights and a devastating defeat for corporate landlord abuse. Sarah sat in stunned silence as she realized she had just witnessed one of the most skillful legal presentations of her career, delivered by someone she had completely underestimated and dismissed. Law. Judge Henderson called for a brief recess before delivering his final ruling. The courtroom emptied as people stepped outside for fresh air and quiet conversations. Sarah remained at her table, staring at her legal papers that now seemed completely inadequate. Her hands were shaking slightly as the full impact of her courtroom defeat began to sink in. Marcus was packing his documents back into his worn leather briefcase with the same calm efficiency he had shown throughout the hearing. Sarah watched him organize his papers and wondered how someone so young could have access to such extensive legal research and case files. Her curiosity finally overcame her embarrassment. Sarah stood up and walked over to the defendant's table where Marcus was finishing his preparations. She cleared her throat softly to get his attention. Marcus looked up with a polite expression, showing no signs of the triumph he had every right to feel after his masterful performance. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have to ask you something. Where did you learn so much about housing law? You seem to know more about tenant rights than most attorneys who specialize in real estate cases." Her tone was respectful now, completely different from the condescending way she had spoken to him before the hearing. Marcus smiled warmly and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a simple white business card and handed it to Sarah without saying a word. Sarah took the card and looked down at it, expecting to see the name of some small legal aid organization or public defender's office. What Sarah saw instead made her jaw drop open in complete shock. The business card was printed on expensive paper with raised lettering that indicated serious professional credentials. It read Marcus Johnson, Doctor of Jurisprudence, Harvard Law School, Order of the Coif. Below his name was listed his position as Senior Associate at Williams, Chen and Associates, one of the most prestigious civil rights law firms in the entire state. Sarah felt her legs go weak as she continued reading the business card. Marcus specialized in housing discrimination, tenant advocacy, and federal civil rights litigation. He had won landmark cases that had established important legal precedents for protecting vulnerable renters. His firm had a reputation for taking on powerful corporations and government agencies that violated people's civil rights. The Order of the Coif designation meant that Marcus had graduated in the top 10% of his class at Harvard Law School, one of the most competitive and respected legal programs in the world. Sarah had graduated from a good regional law school, but nothing close to Harvard's level of academic excellence and prestige. "I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard 3 years ago," Marcus said quietly as Sarah stared at his business card in disbelief. "After law school, I clerked for Judge Patricia Williams on the Federal Court of Appeals. She's considered one of the smartest legal minds in the country and taught me how to research complex cases thoroughly." Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment as she realized the magnitude of her assumptions and prejudices. She had looked at Marcus's simple clothes and youthful appearance and assumed he was inexperienced and poorly educated. In reality, he had better legal credentials than she did and had trained under some of the most respected judges and attorneys in the country. "This particular case is especially important to me because it involves my grandmother," Marcus continued with quiet dignity. "She's the tenant that Peterson Real Estate has been trying to evict illegally. When I found out what was happening to her, I took time off from my regular corporate cases to make sure she got the legal representation she deserved." Sarah realized that Marcus had not just been defending a random client. He had been fighting to protect his own family member from illegal harassment and discrimination. The passion and skill he had shown in court made perfect sense now that she understood his personal connection to the case. "Your grandmother raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, Marcus explained. "She worked 2 jobs to pay for my education and never missed a single school event or graduation ceremony. There was no way I was going to let some corporate landlord push her around just because they thought she couldn't afford a good lawyer." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand the true story behind this case. She had been representing a company that was trying to illegally evict an elderly woman whose grandson happened to be one of the most qualified civil rights attorneys in the state. Peterson Real Estate had picked the wrong target for their predatory business practices. "I specialize in cases exactly like this one," Marcus said as he closed his briefcase. "Williams, Chen and Associates handles housing discrimination lawsuits against landlords who target vulnerable tenants. We've won over $50 million in damages for clients who were illegally evicted or harassed because of their race, age, or economic status." Sarah handed the business card back to Marcus with trembling hands. She felt sick to her stomach as she realized that her client was about to face one of the most skilled and experienced tenant rights attorneys in the region. Peterson Real Estate had not just filed a bad eviction case, they had walked into a legal trap that could destroy their entire business. The brief recess was almost over, and people were starting to return to the courtroom. Sarah knew that Judge Henderson was about to deliver a ruling that would probably end her client's real estate business and possibly result in criminal charges. She also knew that her own reputation as a competent attorney had been seriously damaged by her poor preparation and obvious prejudices. Judge Henderson returned to the courtroom and took his seat behind the bench with a serious expression on his face. Sarah walked back to her table on unsteady legs, knowing that the next few minutes would deliver the most humiliating defeat of her legal career. She had never felt so unprepared and outmatched in a courtroom before. Marcus sat calmly at the defendant's table, his hands folded quietly in front of him. He showed no signs of nervousness or excitement, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew he had presented an overwhelming case. Sarah envied his composure and wished she could feel even a fraction of his certainty about the outcome. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and everyone stood until Judge Henderson gestured for them to be seated. The judge opened the case file and reviewed his notes one final time before looking up at both attorneys. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "I have carefully reviewed all the evidence presented by both sides in this eviction case," Judge Henderson began in a stern voice that filled the quiet courtroom. "What I have discovered is deeply troubling and goes far beyond a simple landlord-tenant dispute. This case involves systematic harassment, illegal business practices, and possible criminal violations of housing law." Sarah felt her stomach drop as the judge continued his analysis of the evidence. She knew that every word he spoke was leading toward a complete victory for Marcus and total defeat for her client. She wished she could disappear from the courtroom and pretend this entire disaster had never happened. The evidence presented by Mr. Johnson clearly demonstrates that Peterson Real Estate has engaged in a pattern of retaliatory eviction attempts against tenants who exercise their legal rights. Judge Henderson continued. The timeline of events shows that this eviction case was filed immediately after the defendant reported serious safety violations to city housing authorities. The judge held up several of the documents that Marcus had presented during his presentation. These building inspection reports and violation notices paint a picture of a landlord who has systematically ignored basic maintenance responsibilities while collecting rent from tenants living in unsafe conditions. This is unacceptable and potentially criminal behavior. Sarah glanced over at Marcus and saw that he was taking notes as the judge spoke, probably preparing for the federal lawsuit he had mentioned filing against Peterson Real Estate. She realized that this courtroom defeat was just the beginning of her client's legal troubles, not the end. Furthermore, the defendant's medical records clearly show that the alleged lease violations were actually reasonable accommodations for an elderly tenant recovering from surgery, Judge Henderson said as he examined the hospital documents Marcus had provided. The plaintiff's failure to investigate these circumstances before filing for eviction demonstrates either gross negligence or willful ignorance of tenant protection laws. The judge's criticism of Sarah's legal work was clear and public. She had failed to do basic research about her client's business practices and had filed a case based on incomplete and misleading information. Her reputation as a thorough and competent attorney was being destroyed in front of everyone in the courtroom. Based on all the evidence presented today, I am denying the plaintiff's request for eviction, Judge Henderson announced in a voice that left no room for appeal. The defendant has clearly established that this eviction case was filed in bad faith and violates multiple tenant protection laws at both the state and federal level. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for what she knew was coming next. The judge was not just going to deny the eviction request. He was going to order damages and possibly refer the case for criminal prosecution. Her client was about to face serious legal and financial consequences for their illegal business practices. I am ordering Peterson Real Estate to pay damages to the defendant in the amount of $15,000 for harassment, illegal entry, and violation of tenant rights. The judge continued. This money will compensate Miss Johnson for the hotel costs, medical expenses, and emotional distress caused by the plaintiff's illegal actions. Marcus remained calm as the judge announced the substantial financial award, but Sarah could see a small smile of satisfaction cross his face. He had not only prevented his grandmother's illegal eviction, but had also secured significant compensation for the suffering Peterson Real Estate had caused her. Additionally, I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation of possible criminal charges related to housing code violations, tenant harassment, and fraudulent business practices, Judge Henderson announced. The evidence suggests that Peterson Real Estate may have engaged in systematic illegal behavior that requires criminal prosecution. Sarah felt like she was watching her client's business collapse in slow motion. Peterson Real Estate would now face not only civil lawsuits but potential criminal charges that could result in huge fines and possible jail time for the company's executives. They had thought they were picking on a helpless elderly tenant, but instead they had attacked the family of one of the state's most skilled civil rights attorneys. Finally, I want to commend Mr. Johnson for his excellent legal work and thorough preparation, the judge said as he looked directly at Marcus. Your presentation today demonstrates the highest standards of legal advocacy and shows what can be accomplished when attorneys truly fight for justice rather than just trying to win cases. The judge's praise for Marcus felt like another slap in the face to Sarah, who had always prided herself on her courtroom skills and legal expertise. She had been completely outclassed by someone she had initially dismissed and disrespected based on his appearance and age. After Judge Henderson left the courtroom, Sarah sat alone at her table for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. The most devastating legal defeat of her career had been delivered by someone she had completely underestimated and disrespected. She felt ashamed of her assumptions and prejudices in a way that cut deeper than any professional embarrassment. Marcus was packing his briefcase and preparing to leave when Sarah finally found the courage to approach him. Her legs felt weak as she walked over to the defendant's table, knowing that she owed him an apology that could never fully make up for her behavior and attitudes. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you a sincere apology for how I treated you today. I made assumptions about you based on your age and appearance that were completely wrong and unfair. I am truly sorry for my disrespectful behavior." Marcus looked up from his briefcase and studied Sarah's face carefully. He could see genuine remorse and shame in her eyes, not just embarrassment about losing the case. After a moment, he nodded and extended his hand to shake hers. "Apology accepted, Miss Mitchell," he said with quiet dignity. "We all make mistakes, and the important thing is learning from them." Sarah shook his hand gratefully, feeling some of the weight of guilt lift from her shoulders. "But I want you to know that this experience has opened my eyes to some serious problems with my own thinking," she continued. "I realize now that I have been making judgments about people based on stereotypes and prejudices that I didn't even know I had." Marcus sat down in one of the wooden chairs and gestured for Sarah to sit beside him. "This kind of unconscious bias is more common than most people want to admit," he said thoughtfully. "The legal profession especially has problems with people making assumptions based on race, age, gender, and economic background. The important thing is recognizing these biases and working to change them." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand how her attitudes had affected not just this case, but probably many other situations throughout her career. How many times had she dismissed people or failed to take them seriously because of superficial characteristics that had nothing to do with their abilities or knowledge? "I grew up in a wealthy family where success was measured by money and status symbols," Sarah admitted honestly. "My parents taught me that appearance and social connections were more important than character or actual ability. I never questioned those values until today when you showed me how wrong they can be." Marcus listened patiently as Sarah continued to explain her background and the experiences that had shaped her worldview. He could see that she was genuinely trying to understand her own prejudices and make changes in how she thought about other people. This level of self-reflection was rare and encouraging. The truth is that many successful people have advantages that have nothing to do with their personal merit, Marcus said gently. "I was lucky to have a grandmother who valued education and worked multiple jobs to pay for my schooling. Without her sacrifices, I never would have had the opportunity to attend Harvard or work at a prestigious law firm." Sarah nodded as she began to understand that success came from many different sources, not just family wealth and social connections. She realized that Marcus had probably worked much harder than she ever had to achieve his legal credentials and professional success. His accomplishments were even more impressive because of the obstacles he had overcome. "I want to learn from this experience and become a better person and attorney," Sarah said with sincere determination. "Would you be willing to help me understand how I can recognize and change these unconscious biases that I clearly have? I don't want to make the same mistakes again with other people." Marcus smiled warmly at Sarah's genuine desire to grow and change. "Education and awareness are the first steps toward overcoming prejudice," he replied. "I would suggest reading books about unconscious bias, attending diversity training programs, and most importantly, making an effort to really listen to people from different backgrounds without making assumptions about their abilities or experiences." Sarah pulled out her phone and began taking notes as Marcus gave her specific recommendations for books, articles, and training programs that could help her understand and address her own biases. She felt grateful that he was willing to help her learn despite how poorly she had treated him earlier in the day. "I also think you should consider using your legal skills to help people who really need them," Marcus suggested thoughtfully. "Corporate law can be lucrative, but representing people who are fighting for their basic rights can be much more rewarding. There are many organizations that need experienced attorneys to help with civil rights cases and social justice issues." The idea of using her legal expertise to help vulnerable people instead of just making money for wealthy corporations appealed to Sarah in a way she had never expected. She began to imagine what it would feel like to win cases that actually made a positive difference in people's lives, rather than just increasing profits for big businesses. As they talked, Sarah learned more about Marcus's work with housing discrimination cases, voting rights litigation, and other civil rights issues. She was impressed by his passion for justice and his commitment to helping people who could not afford expensive legal representation. His approach to practicing law was completely different from her own career focus. Before they left the courthouse, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "Marcus, would your law firm be interested in partnering with someone who has corporate law experience?" she asked hopefully. "I have connections with wealthy clients who might be willing to donate money to support civil rights cases, and I could help with the business and financial aspects of running a social justice practice." Marcus considered her offer carefully before responding. "We are always looking for attorneys who are committed to fighting for justice and equality," he said after a moment. "If you are serious about making this kind of change in your career, I would be happy to introduce you to the partners at my firm and discuss possible collaboration opportunities." Sarah felt a sense of excitement and purpose that she had never experienced in her corporate law career. The prospect of using her legal skills to help people who were facing discrimination and injustice gave her a feeling of meaning that all her previous courtroom victories had never provided. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few hours. She had entered the building that morning as an arrogant attorney who looked down on people she considered beneath her social status. She was leaving as someone who had learned important lessons about prejudice, justice, and what really mattered in both law and life. The young man she had dismissed and disrespected had become her teacher and possibly her future colleague in fighting for social justice. Marcus's quiet dignity and exceptional legal skills had not only saved his grandmother from illegal eviction, but had also opened the eyes of a successful lawyer who thought she knew everything about the legal profession. Sarah knew that changing her attitudes and career focus would not be easy, but she was committed to becoming the kind of attorney who fought for justice rather than just winning cases. The most humiliating defeat of her legal career had turned into the most important learning experience of her entire life.